Welcome to VSOW. Today, we're diving deep into some really fascinating notes all about the TV series The Wire.
That's right. A show that still generates so much discussion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And our goal here isn't just to recap plots, but to really dig into what scholars and, well, dedicated viewers are saying about its cultural weight, its commentary on society.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about it as a cultural text, how it reflects things like policing, drug policy, race in America, but also maybe how it shapes how we see those things.
Exactly. So we've pulled together notes from a few different places for this.
Yeah, we've got notes based on a Reddit discussion applying moral philosophy to the characters, which sounds interesting.
Definitely. And then there's Ben Lamb's book, The Wire, A Cultural History.
A big overview, that one.
Mhm.
We also have the collection The Wire, race, class, and genre more academic essays there.
And finally, an article by Steve Waitman specifically on the wire and drug policy called No One Wins. One side just loses more slowly.
That title really captures the show's mood, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, so let's kick off with that Reddit discussion on moral theories. What was the basic idea there?
Well, the person who started it suggested mapping characters onto different ethical frameworks. Like Philosophy 101, but for The Wire.
Okay, interesting. Like who?
They proposed McNulty as an act utilitarian, someone focused purely on the outcome, the consequences, even if it means breaking rules.
That sounds like McNulty, yeah. Always
Wow.
chasing the result.
Right. And then most other cops, maybe as rule utilitarians, trying to follow the rules generally, believing it leads to the best overall outcomes, though maybe with some flexibility.
Hmm.
Then you had Frank Sabatka, pegged as a deontologist, all about duty, his obligation to the union above all else.
Duty bound. Yeah, I see that.
The drug dealers, broadly as ethical egoists, basically acting in their own self-interest within the rules of the game.
The game is the game.
Exactly. And Stringer Bell, as maybe a particularly successful or ambitious ethical egoist, trying to kind of transcend the street game with business principles.
Right, applying Adam Smith to the drug trade.
Sort of, yeah. And Omar was put down as maybe an ethical subjectivist, but one with his own strong, intuitive moral code. A man's got to have a code.
Okay, so that was the starting point. But I imagine the discussion didn't just stop there. People must have pushed back.
Oh, absolutely. That's what made the notes on it interesting. A big point was that you can't just slap these labels on. You really need to, look closely at the show, specific scenes, actual quotes, to make a strong case.
It speaks to the depth of the characters, doesn't it? They're not just archetypes.
Totally. And it also led into thinking about David Simon's big picture themes. Post-industrial America, the damage of unchecked capitalism, how institutions treat people like cogs, like capital.
That's the core tragedy of the show, in many ways.
And this forces characters into these impossible binds, right? Either you compromise your integrity to survive within the institution, or you try to maintain your integrity and the system just grinds you down.
And the terrible irony is that neither choice really works out well in the long run.
Pretty much. So the discussion became about how these different ethical systems, utilitarianism, deontology, egoism, how do they actually cope with that central conflict?
And did analyzing it that way lead to critiques of the ethical systems themselves?
Yeah, a bit. By looking at the consequences of characters' choices, people started questioning the frameworks. Like, okay, McNulty as act utilitarian, most agreed that fit his focus on outcomes over rules.
That makes sense. His methods were always questionable, but aimed at a specific goal.
But the idea of the whole police force being rule utilitarians got complicated. People pointed out, yes, there's a command structure, rules are important, but they bend them all the time for stats, for promotions, for convenience.
The juking the stats storyline.
Exactly. So maybe it's a more cynical or self-serving utilitarianism within the institution itself.
What about someone like Garcetti, the politician? How did he fit in?
His arc was seen as kind of a shift, starting maybe as an idealist, but ending up as a pretty cynical act utilitarian. Remember when he supported McNulty's fake serial killer?
Yeah, because it helped his career, served his political ends.
Right. Sacrificing truth for what he saw as the necessary outcome for his own advancement. Another example of that compromise.
It's grimly realistic. Any other interesting character takes from that thread?
Let's see. The Greeks were seen as almost pure deontologists, but their duty was strictly to their business, their bottom line, regardless of human cost.
Business is business.
Pretty much. Bubs, especially later on, some saw hints of Kantian ethics, like recognizing his failings, feeling that deep sense of guilt and moral responsibility.
That's an interesting reading of Bubs.
Omar's status as a simple relativist was also challenged. His code, while unconventional, was very consistent and strong, not just making it up as he went along.
True, there were lines he wouldn't cross.
And then you had figures like Maurice Levy, the lawyer, and Clay Davis, generally seen as nihilists, no real code beyond self-interest and, well, corruption.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's amazing how a discussion like that can peel back so many layers.
Okay, let's shift gears to Ben Lamb's book, The Wire, A Cultural History. What's the main thrust of his argument about the show's impact?
Lamb really emphasizes how The Wire's relevance has almost grown over time. He points out, depressingly, that so many issues the show tackled, uh, racial tensions, political division, inequality, problems in policing, the drug war's effects, they haven't gone away. If anything, they're more visible now.
So it wasn't just a snapshot of the early 2000s. It was kind of predicting the direction things were heading.
That's a big part of his argument, yeah. It feels prescient. He also looks at how the show influenced perceptions, maybe especially outside the U.S., of American policing, drug laws, race relations.
And he connects it to binge watching.
Yeah, he suggests it was one of the key shows that helped kickstart that whole obsessive, serialized streaming culture. He also goes into the background Simon's history, how the show was conceived, casting, the real people behind the characters.
Giving that historical context.
Right, and situating it within the history of cop shows, showing how it both used and subverted those genre conventions. He also really grounds it in the specific history of Baltimore, the port, the schools, the politics, the racial dynamics. You need that context to understand the story fully.
Absolutely.
And one interesting point he makes is about the show's portrayal of the declining newspaper industry season 5 and how that almost foreshadowed aspects of rising populism and the changing media landscape globally.
That's a connection I hadn't explicitly made, but it makes sense.
Yeah, and Lamb tracks the show's influence everywhere: university courses, its impact on Baltimore itself, discussions around Black Lives Matter, even potentially on drug law debates internationally, and definitely on how ambitious TV gets made now.
So he sees it as a really major cultural force reflecting America at a kind of crossroads.
Definitely. A very significant cultural artifact.
Okay, now let's look at the collection The Wire. Race, class, and genre. This sounds more focused on critical analysis, maybe for teaching.
Yeah, it's framed that way, a critical and pedagogical tool. The essays really dissect the show's form, its narrative strategies, how it makes its political points. They get into debates about realism, genre, authorship.
Authorship, like who gets the credit? Simon! Burns! The writer's room.
Kind of, yeah. The complexity of creation in a collaborative medium. But more centrally, they explore how the show depicts systemic failure versus individual agency. How much control do people really have in these environments?
That's the constant tension.
And they really praise its nuanced portrayal of race and class, arguing it moves way beyond the simplistic stuff you often see on TV. They also look at how different audiences read the show, how its meaning gets made. It's not just one thing.
So reception is part of the analysis, too.
Definitely. And there's this idea of a tension between the show's artistry, its aesthetic innovation, and its social commentary. Are they working together or sometimes pulling apart?
Interesting. And this documentary vernacular idea comes up here.
Yes, that term is used to describe its style blending fiction with this incredibly raw, authentic feel, like you're eavesdropping on real life. It blurs those lines.
That's key to its power, I think. That feeling of authenticity.
The collection also looks at the range of responses: academic, public, showing how it sparks debate. It talks about the uses of the wire, how it can mobilize knowledge, challenge assumptions.
Make you question things you took for granted.
Exactly. The editors argue it asks fundamental questions. How does society work? What rules govern us? What are these institutions really doing? What's happening in America? They suggest it's almost the quintessential American story in some ways.
Wow, that's a bold claim.
It is. They also talk about using the show to analyze sociological concepts, urban studies. It's crossed over into many academic fields.
Beyond just TV studies.
For sure. They discuss its relationship to social realism, its narrative complexity, all those interweaving plot lines, how demanding it is for the viewer.
You really do have to pay attention. No checking your phone during The Wire.
Right, and this idea that it requires an interpretative community, that the show works best when people talk about it, debate it, share perspectives.
Like we're doing now.
Pretty much. They analyze how viewers grapple with the moral ambiguity, the importance of the local dialect, the critique of power structures, the use of non-professional actors, all contributing to its realist aesthetics. And that phrase again, no one wins, one side just loses more slowly, is seen as absolutely central.
That feeling of inevitable decline, or at least slow attrition, it hangs over everything. Okay, finally, let's get into Steve Wakeman's article focused specifically on drug policy.
Right. Wakeman argues The Wire is basically a crucial cultural text for understanding drug policy debates. It
Mhm.
shows the clash between control efforts and the reality of illicit markets.
And he thinks it reveals broader problems in how modern democracies handle these issues.
Yes, broader problems of governance in what he calls neoliberal democracies. He kicks off with that Snoop quote, "Real is pretend and pretend is real," to get at the complex relationship between the show's fiction and real-world policy.
It sets the stage for that blurred line.
He notes that while criminologists are increasingly interested in media, there hasn't been that much deep cultural criminological work specifically on The Wire's depiction of drug markets and policy, even though they're so central.
So he's trying to fill that gap.
Exactly. He wants to explore its heuristic potential, basically, how it can help us think and learn about these issues. He avoids simple readings, saying it's not just propaganda for one side, nor just postmodern play, it's doing something more complex.
Reflecting and challenging.
That's his synthetic and critical framework. It reflects dominant ideas but also pushes back against them. He sees it as this space where drug policy questions get reimagined. He even cites William Julius Wilson, the sociologist, who famously said, "The Wire did more to explain urban poverty than tons of academic work."
That's high praise indeed.
It is. And Wakeman mentions all the university courses on the show, calling it a kind of social science fiction because of how groundbreaking and insightful it is.
Social science fiction, I like that. It captures the blend of realism and imaginative scenarios.
He emphasizes its roots in the real experiences of Simon and Burns. He brings in Ojek's idea of it being subjectively realistic portrayals of things that might seem unreal, like the fake serial killer or Amsterdam itself. These aren't real events, but they feel real. They expose real dynamics.
And the use of real Baltimore people and places adds to that authenticity.
Hugely. Wakeman notes Simon's intent to critique the American dream, show the America left behind, and how the show critiques neoliberal capitalism through the game. But he also warns against focusing only on what the creators intended.
Right, because people interpret it differently.
Exactly. He uses the example of the UK politician Chris Grayling using the show to argue for tougher law and order, completely missing, Wakeman argues, the show's deeper critique. It shows how the text can be twisted.
A powerful example of misreading.
So Wakeman insists its more than fiction status is key. It inspires sociological thinking, it's transcendental television, embodying these reality representation tensions.
Okay, so how does he apply this specifically to drug policy analysis in the show?
He focuses on two main things: the depiction of street-level heroin and crack dealing, and the whole Amsterdam plotline in season 3.
Two massive parts of the show.
He discusses how the show portrays a city saturated by the drug trade, largely because of prohibition creating this violent black market. It's woven into everything. He uses characters like Wallace, Bubbles, Body as examples of the human cost, the victims.
Highlighting the unintended consequences of prohibition.
Precisely. The policy creates the monster it's trying to fight. He points to the links between the trade, poverty, marginalization, political corruption. It's all interconnected in the show's Baltimore.
And Amsterdam.
He analyzes Amsterdam as this radical, bottom-up attempt at reform, creating zones where drug dealing is tolerated under certain rules.
Yeah.
He goes into Colvin's motivations, the temporary positive effects, lower crime, less violence, better access for outreach workers, arguing it maps the limits of the war on drugs and hints at alternatives.
It's such a provocative storyline. Makes you really grapple with harm reduction ideas.
Wakeman uses it to show The Wire as this cultural paradigm. He looks at the problems prohibition creates in the show: bad drug quality leading to health issues and more crime, like Stromer's point about weak dope needing more sales, and the violence.
Both police violence and dealer-on-dealer violence.
Exactly. He argues the police violence often stems from the ideology of prohibition itself, seeing users' dealers as inherently wicked. And the dealer violence is maintained by its own internal codes and culture. Omore's code, for instance, paradoxically legitimizes violence within the game by distinguishing it from harming civilians.
So it's not just economic, it's ideological and cultural too.
Right. And Wakeman connects all this to marginalization, but also notes how neoliberal capitalist thinking permeates the drug crews themselves. D'Angelo's McNugget speech, Stringer's economics classes, they're trapped by the system, but also reproducing its logic.
A cycle of reinforcement.
Yeah, the law responds to the game responds to the law, the system replicates itself Wakeman sees the show placing the regulatory system itself at the core of the problem.
So does he see the show offering clear solutions?
Not exactly solutions, but he argues it has huge potential to reframe the debate. Amsterdam, for him, suggests we need to get beyond just prohibition versus legalization and think about more radical alternatives. He links it to real-world examples,
Hmm.
like Swiss heroin prescription or Dutch pill testing policies that treat markets as markets, trying to regulate them differently.
Thinking outside the criminal law box.
Exactly. He brings in regulatory theory, nodal governance ideas about how power works in networks, not just top-down from the state. Amsterdam, he suggests, could be seen as a nascent form of this empowering marginalized groups to improve governance locally.
Like the Zwela model he mentions in South Africa.
Yeah, finding parallels where community involvement reduced problems. Amsterdam tried to harness collective resources like Carver's tax on dealers for kids' lunches or sports gear embodying active responsibility. It tried to responsibilize the dealers in a different way.
Even though it ultimately failed politically.
Right. And Wakeman says that failure is paradoxically part of its power. Amsterdam doesn't give us the answer, but it fundamentally recalibrates the questions we should be asking. He even points to Hurt calling Carver a communist for his tax, suggesting the show directs our attention to capitalism itself as an underlying issue.
So the problem isn't just drug policy. It's intertwined with deeper political and economic ideologies.
That's the ultimate point. You can't fix the problems caused by the drug market within the same ideological framework that supports the current system of control. We need, he suggests, radically divergent thinking about both governance and drug control.
A fundamental reevaluation.
Yeah, tweaking the current system might help a bit, but The Wire, in Wakeman's view, shows us we need to question the whole thing, purpose, principles, methods, if we actually want to reduce the harms.
That is a powerful takeaway from the show and a really thorough analysis. It definitely gives you a framework for understanding why the show feels so important and, sadly, still so relevant.
Absolutely. These academic and critical perspectives really highlight its depth and its lasting significance.
Well, we hope this deep dive into these different notes on The Wire has given you some valuable insights, maybe some new ways to think about the series and its engagement with these really big societal issues.
Yeah, the fact that it supports this level of analysis really speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It really does.
Hmm.
So what stood out most to you listening today? Did any of these interpretations resonate or maybe spark new questions?
It might even be worth revisiting the show or parts of it with some of these ideas, moral philosophy, cultural history, policy critique in mind.
Definitely. And if you found this exploration helpful or engaging, we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe, maybe leave a like, or drop a comment. Your feedback genuinely helps us figure out what kind of deep dives you're interested in.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.